Brett Ledbetter, welcome to the Way of Champions podcast. This is long overdue. I'm so happy to have you here.
Likewise.
Another thing I'm thankful for if we can be thankful in a pandemic, getting a guy like yourself on here, who's usually like me on the road many, many days a year, running here, there, and everywhere. And now we're working from home.
That's right.
Yeah. So how has your world changed in the last year? I mean, you spent a lot of times working with college athletic departments and programs and coaches. And I imagine like me, you're doing that virtually now, huh?
Pre-COVID, I was on the road about 20 days a month.
Mm-hmm.
And since COVID, everything's converted to digital, which I found to be pretty good from an individual standpoint because you're able to sleep in the same bed every night and get in a rhythm. So I think the clarity from a one-on-one perspective has been great. I think the challenge is how do you connect and feel the room inside of teams, particularly when there's turnover and you haven't met people in person and their first exposure is just the screen.
Yeah,
So,
I feel exactly the same way. I'm like, I don't know you yet. And when I started some of the teams that I work with, when I first met kids, there's like, this kid's in Germany and this kid's in New Zealand and this kid's, and then there's three of them on campus and whatever, but they're in different rooms and
different time zones.
Different time zones. It's been a crazy year. Yet you never stop working. I mean, you're unbelievable. And well, we're going to talk about your new book here, but maybe just give a little background for our listeners about what you do, your background in sport, but because I don't know if I told you this, but at least like once every 2 months, I get an email from one of our listeners saying, "Why haven't you had Brett Ledbetter on yet?" So
we've been trying.
We've been trying. That's definitely true. So yeah, tell people about what you do. And
So just a short background. In my early 20s, I started a basketball academy, and I worked with 5th through 12th graders, men and women. And I really loved that space. And through a sequence of events, I met a coach at Florida through Daniel Coyle, who wrote The Talent Code. Mm-hmm. And then that led to that coach introducing me to Becky Burleigh, who is a co-founder of What Drives Winning. And then I just naturally started working with her and then her team. And then we started a collaboration at the University of Florida. And that was an enriching experience for everyone that participated. And we said, why don't we try and do that on a national level? Mm-hmm. And so we started the What Drives Winning conference. And the idea was to bring thought leaders from across the country to one location and then have the attendance just underwrite it. So we would break even and then we would produce videos and release them for free to help the masses. And so we did that, and then things just sort of took off. And now athletic departments hire me to be a thinking partner to coaches, to teams, and that's where I spend the majority of my time.
Yeah, and I love that you have that term thinking partner on your website, which is great because it's certainly kind of what Jerry and I do a lot of. And I'm constantly amazed how many coaches, top coaches, don't have a thinking partner, do they?
I didn't know that until I got into it, but it seems to be the case.
Yeah.
And I think that the reason we like the word thinking partner is just because if it were about having the answers, I probably wouldn't work with any of the people that I do. It's because they're so competent that they just need someone to help unlock their thinking sometimes and just take them to a deep level, because just the complexities that they're dealing with, I have no idea all the different forces. And just to hear how their minds work, it gives you an appreciation for their positions.
It does. And I think the big thing is this, that when you're a Division I coach, who do you go to for advice, right? You're not necessarily, like, of course you talk to your staff, but which of your peers? You're not going to, if you're at Duke, you're not asking North Carolina for advice, right? Because that's your competitor. And then, some athletic departments I've found are very collaborative and everyone's door is open, and others, there's certain coaches that are, you don't go near them. And so I've been amazed how many top coaches have said it's just nice to have someone to bounce ideas off of.
Mhm.
And so the trickle down effect of this that I always say is, if the top coaches in the world are looking for someone to bounce ideas off of, high school coach, youth coach, who are you bouncing ideas off of, right?
No question. I think it's been interesting because I don't know if I would have thought this way before I jumped into this, but excellence is hard at any level,
Mhm.
and it takes an incredible investment. And so the more you can build a support community, and I think that's why these department collaborations are so powerful, is because they have the context of the university and everyone understands those challenges.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, when you go from assistant to head coach, you're primarily working with human related issues.
Mhm.
And there's a natural vulnerability that comes with being a head coach
Mhm.
because everything's so visible and the arrows are coming at you, that they're more likely to share in that room. Whereas
Mhm.
maybe assistants haven't had that layer of vulnerability quite yet
Yeah.
to, you know.
Greg Dale from Duke calls it the 16-inch shift, right? From the assistant coaching chair to the head coaching chair, right? Of like all of a sudden you go from giving suggestions to making decisions. And it's really hard to understand that until you've sat in that seat, for sure.
And I
Yeah.
think that vulnerability is what creates the connection.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. So, of these coaches, and I have to recommend, if any of our listeners are new to your work, I've been on your email list for many years. I think since your first book came out, and these videos that you have released from your conferences have been fantastic. I look forward to getting them in my inbox. I don't say always watch them, but I almost always watch them, and I always get some just great tidbits. And I mean, the list of people that you've been able to engage with, not just Becky on a regular basis, Gino Oriema, Brad Stevens, Anson Dorrance, Chris Peterson, PJ Fleck was a recent one. I mean, talk about what are, Sue Enquist. I mean, that list goes on and on. They're all over
Who
your
was your
website.
favorite?
Oh man, I I am one of my favorite ones is when Anson Dorrance tells the story of the rose.
Mhm.
Right. Like, I think it's just an amazing story. And I've known Anson and stuff, and I just love the story. And I think when he did it at, I think, was that your first conference? Or yeah, it's just awesome. It's such a powerful, powerful metaphor and a powerful story. So that was a one. And then there was one last year, and I think it was just pre-COVID. And I'm not remembering the specific context, but it was about University of Oregon women's basketball, and I think it was about Ionescu. Is that her last name? Yeah, learning that my job is to make everyone else better on the court, and I thought that was a really cool one too. So
Her transformation was remarkable.
yeah, yeah, and yeah. I mean, talk about that. Like, what are some of the things when you've walked into these locker rooms or worked with these coaches that you've just gone, man, that was gold right there?
Well, that particular one was really powerful for me
Maybe
because
maybe frame that story, because I certainly didn't just tell it very well. So
so basically I started working with Sabrina when she was a junior and basically had limited context into her whole situation, but knew that she was extremely talented. And then through a series of questions, she arrived that she wanted a PhD in elevating her teammates.
mm,
And so that was where we spent the majority of our conversations on how to do that. And that was her junior year. And then she decided to come back for her senior year, and they were preseason ranked number one. She was going to be the most visible college basketball player. And one of her mentors, Kobe Bryant, passed away.
mhm,
She was asked to speak at his celebration. And just that day, She spoke at his celebration. She flew to Stanford. They beat Stanford. She had a triple double, and then she eclipsed the 2,000, 1,000, 1,000 mark.
Mm-hmm.
And just to see how everyone galvanized around Kobe's legacy,
Mm-hmm.
and to see how Kobe's life impacted all walks of life,
Mm-hmm.
I think gave her a real sense of understanding what her mission was from that point forward. And when you're in the middle of that and you can feel it everywhere, you just know you're in a moment, and you just try to turn in the student moment and just soak in everything that you can. And it culminated with her giving a speech on Black History Night in front of a packed arena, and they played the song Everglow, and everyone put their phones up, and it just paid tribute to how Kobe's legacy brought them together.
Mm. It's amazing. I got goosebumps hearing you tell it again, and I get goosebumps the first time I watch the video, and just this idea, because I think there's it's certainly in youth sports in the US, there's an innate selfishness. What do I get out of this, right? And then that permeates into teams where you have athletes like, what can I get? What can I get? Get to play my favorite position, get to start every game, get to take all the shots, whatever it is. But yet great teams have, and great athletes, what can I give? And that giving thing is what Kobe realized as he got older. And I think what a lot of amazing athletes and great leaders realize is, it's not what I get, it's what I give. And I just thought that her lesson was such a powerful one. That what if all of our best players spent all their time focusing on elevating their teammates instead of just elevating themselves?
There's no doubt. And every chance she got, I mean, even in the Black History Month game where they were going to honor her for 2,000, 1,000, 1,000, she's leveraging that platform to share with the community and the team the impact on how they've given her strength through adversity.
It's the kind of teammate you want too, isn't it?
No question. And Sabrina had like her standard was so high that she's one of those players that you'll never outwork, because if she's at an 8 and you get to an 8, she's going to do a 9. Like there's just never what you're going to catch her. And she has this unique way to elevate the standard. So I think about this line that Jay Wright has about teams. And he said that the key to building a great team is to get your best player the most committed to your core values. And I think in that case, Sabrina had that, but then she had an amazing group of people around her, and Ruthie, that could be the person that puts the arm around the shoulder. Satu. I mean, they had 3 top 7 picks that year.
Yeah, no,
It
for
was
sure.
a bummer they couldn't play it because of COVID.
Yeah, that's right. That was last March or whatever. I love that idea, Jay Wright's quote as well, because this is what I think one of the things as coaches we have to be really intentional about, which is find our cultural architects, right? Find the people that epitomize what we value most. And if we can do that, and that's our best player, then we can go really far, because he or she will usually drag others with him. If our best player is a cultural assassin, lives outside the rules, and we don't condemn that, they'll very likely to drag the team down with them too, won't they?
I think that's what makes the NBA such an interesting league, because coaches understand that they want to get everyone to a certain standard. And when you don't have the power, how do you figure out a way to influence that individual that it's in the best case for them and the team for them to go a separate way?
When we had Steve Kerr on this podcast, he talked about one of his first things with Golden State was asking Andre Iguodala to be the 6th man. And, he had just come off U.S. national team all-star and said, now come off the bench. And he said that was such a key thing, because if, everyone looked at him and say, this guy's an all-star and he's willing to come off the bench, I probably shouldn't complain. about my playing time or whatever. And then that year in the finals, when they went with a small lineup and he started and they won their first championship. But he said that was such a cool thing, and what an amazing human being Iggy was to do that. And then 2 years ago when he came out with his biography, it was called The Sixth Man, right? Because he embraced that role of what can I give to my group. And that is something that coaches, like, we really need to, who's going to help us elevate our goals or our values, and who's potentially going to cut them out from under us, and what can we do? And yeah, the NBA is weird because the players have a lot of power there.
There's no doubt. And so that's an ideal case. What I love to study is what happens when the sixth man doesn't want to embrace that role.
Mm.
And what kind of waves does that create inside a team?
Mm-hmm. And you talk about this in your new book, What Drives Winning Environments.
Did you read it?
I haven't read it yet. No, I've not read it yet.
Yeah, I would love to hear, just because all the people that you've interviewed, obviously, I would love to know what would stick with you the most.
Yeah. I mean, I was trying to find out as much about it as possible. And one of the things, the basic theme, right? How do you build an environment where people can be at their very best? And I think that one of those principles that you talk about in that is sort of above the line versus below the line behavior. And we've had Tim Kite on this podcast talking about that. So maybe break that down in case someone doesn't understand what that is. Because I think that's a very powerful and visual concept for people.
So the question we asked, that you alluded to, is how do you build an environment where people can do their best work? And so what we found is that how you define, manage, and model your expectations largely contributes to that. So if you think about defining, that's where you create clarity around your expectation, and that draws a line. This is our program standards. And then anything that meets or exceeds that would be considered above the line behavior. Mm-hmm. Anything that doesn't would be considered below the line behavior. Mm-hmm. And so that moves you more into the management side, where when you have behavior that is above the line, how do you catch that in a surgical way that matters to where it reinforces and repeats that behavior? And then when things are below the line, how do you convert it in a way that aligns with who you are as a coach? Mm-hmm. So many times we see situations catch coaches off guard. Mm-hmm. And those are the moments where trust is earned and lost with your team. Mm-hmm. And if they have an impulsive reaction that is not in line with who they want to be, mm-hmm. it's hard to ask your players to do the same. And then ultimately that speaks to the modeling piece, which mm-hmm. is the example you're setting, that the best coaches I've been around are the physical manifestation of what they expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. People hear what you say, but they remember what you do. And I think you just alluded to something that's really important as well, is it's easy to have beautiful values and say, this is how I'm going to coach. This is how I'm going to lead. This is how I'm going to manage in the off season, in the whatever. But like you said, in those moments of stress, right? In those moments of high anxiety, in that tie game with 10 seconds left and you have a turnover, that's where people look to a coach. And that's where that coach has to be, I think, as Tim called it, not default behavior, but disciplined behavior, right? You have to train yourself so in that moment, you respond appropriately. And if you don't react, but you respond, that's when the magic happens, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we try and work with coaches is to build a strong interior. And if you think about peace, inner peace, and you define peace as freedom from disturbance, the goal then becomes, how do you not let what's happening outside of your body dictate your internal experience?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Such as go on more about that the world around you, that you're fulfilled.
So if something bad is going on outside of you, mm-hmm. so often that can dictate a negative emotional reaction inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
And then emotion takes the wheel, and
Yeah.
you're no longer strategic or intentional with how you're responding to those things.
Yeah. And how often too do we, when something happens in our life as a coach, a fight with our spouse, we get in a car accident on the way to work. And so we have that, that emotional response, but we look at it towards the circumstances of our life. Oh, this happened, so of course I'm in a bad mood today. But yet, oftentimes with our players, when they're having a bad day, we never ask them, hey, is everything okay? And so then we tend to default to, well, they just don't care.
Yeah, and I think that reminds me of a coaching line from Jack Clark. It's why guess when you can know.
Mm-hmm.
And the behavior is typically the symptom.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the source. And so the more strategic you are with your questioning, you can hopefully get to the source and create a long-term solution by understanding what's going on inside of them.
So all these coaches, I mean, they're great communicators, aren't they?
I think that they're great somehow. And I think the best thing that I've learned is that I know I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many different ways that you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, when you're thinking about how do you have a healthy approach towards sustaining high performance,
Mm-hmm.
I think that those three pieces are really important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, so in your mind, like the role of the coach is to define and implement and model those core values that
Come on,
drive.
man, you got to read this book.
What's
It's
that?
you got to read the book. So it's define,
Uh-huh.
manage, model.
I didn't want to quote you directly. I was trying to throw in my own. Okay, so implement, manage. What? Okay, so define. I put implement because you have to take them from your head to your team, right? And then manage. How do you manage them?
So if you think about management, it's a reactive measure. So an event has happened, and now you're trying to leverage that event to
Mm-hmm.
create repeated behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's different strategies you can use. And one of the things that we're talking about, particularly as it becomes below the line,
Mm-hmm.
is if you have power on your side,
Mm-hmm.
which from the college level down, that's going to be normally the case.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't use that, it seems that you get more influence. And so we have two different tools that we talk about. There's power tools,
Mm-hmm.
forcing control, and then there's pro tools, winning influence.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's below the line behavior, there's a variety of ways that you can convert that
Mm-hmm.
in a way that helps them own it. So for example, a coach told me that he had a player that was in a slump, and he asked me to work with him. And so I sat down with the player and I said, if a teammate was going through the exact scenario,
Mm-hmm.
what advice would you give them? Can you write it out? Take 5 to 10 minutes, just be intentional with the words.
Mm-hmm.
So he comes back and shares the advice, and it's all about not listening to the outside noise, not thinking the only way you add value is scoring. All these different things that if repetitions inside a gym won't fix.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don't create the platform for them to talk about those things, it makes it difficult for us to help fix what they don't externalize.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember that clip 2 seasons ago, the Steph Curry, when he was going over their sort of plus minus when he was on the floor? It was just like one of those like NBA outtake clips, and they're sitting on the bench and Steph's down because he's missed his last 5 3-pointers. He said, yeah, here's your scoring, but here's what we're doing when you're out there. Right. So, and I think he finished with like, carry on, my son, or something like that. Right. And it was just like that communication. Right. And then you just saw Steph Curry, right? One of the best players in the world, lit up like a little boy who just got a compliment from his coach. Right. So it doesn't matter if you're an NBA all-star or if you're a 12-year-old, this stuff applies, doesn't it?
Providing perspective. And
Yeah.
so often when you're in the middle of it, it feels way bigger than it actually is. It reminds me of something that Billy Donovan did with a player, where he had a player that went 2 for 11 and he played 38 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And he walked in the next day because this player, things weren't going his way. He wouldn't play well. Things were, he'd be the captain of the team that they needed him to be. And he said, how many shots did you miss last night? And the player said 9. He said, how long does it take for you to shoot a shot? Player said, a second. Because so let me get this straight. You allowed 9 seconds to affect the rest of the 37 minutes and 51 seconds you were in.
Mm-hmm.
And then he just walked out. And to me, it's like anytime you can lend perspective that we're allowing the minority to affect the majority, I think it helps people think about it different and unlock a better performance.
Yeah, 100%. And so often the role of the coach is to give that 30,000-foot overview, right? To be able to say, you know, hey, look, you're adding in different ways, and maybe it's not on the score sheet. And again, I think it's because we have a generation of kids who are brought up to only look at how many points did you score, how many assists. I need to play this position because that's who scores the goals, and no one cares about the defenders in soccer or whatever it is, right? And I think sometimes higher level coaches, high school coaches, college coaches, we have to kind of coach that out of them, that you can be contributing even if it doesn't appear in the score line and stuff like that. And sometimes it's one of our biggest jobs, isn't it?
I think it takes a sophisticated manager to combat what's going on. And I think the higher the level you go, just using Steve Kerr as an example, these guys at that level make so much money. And so because their money is public, the expectations that they carry from the cities are insane. And so what you find at that level is that as an NBA coach, it sometimes helps to support your superstar because they're getting so many arrows that are being shot at them from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I think that's the role of a modern coach, man. And I think that's why I love studying NBA coaches, because the sophistication to stick in that league as a head coach, I mean, that is a hard job, and it requires excellence.
Mm. And what's other, the other arrows come from the community, from the newspaper writers, but we had Ron Adams on here, Steve's assistant, talking about, how the job of a modern coach now in the NBA, but certainly other sports too, is, at halftime to get people off their phones because they're reading what people are tweeting about them. Right. And I don't know if the college programs you work with, maybe they have a little more power over to say, hey, no phones in the locker room or not. But now you have people who are just total anonymous strangers. And yet we tend to focus, right? Our human instinct is to focus on that negative tweet from someone who doesn't know us and we don't know them more than the words of our coach, who we love and trust. Right. I mean, it's a whole other challenge that the John Woodens of the world didn't deal with.
Well, it's an illustration that for the distraction, like you have to build an interior strength to combat that. And I think about one of the things that Jeremy Foley, who's the athletic director at Florida, would say is that if you have 2,000 people saying bad things and 2,000 people saying good things, if you read those, the bottom line is you just read 4,000 messages and you weren't doing your job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Right. You're far better off shutting it off. Okay. So all these coaches that you've worked with over the years, had time to get to know, is there a story or two that like really sticks out that just encompasses for you the secret sauce, or what great coaching is truly about?
That would be, so I'm on your podcast right now. Who's the best guest you've ever had?
Who's the best?
Yep.
Well, you know what? It would depend on who's listening.
Well, so that's my point, right?
Yeah.
So like,
I'm
and
asking your favorite. I'm asking
and
your favorite.
I think to me, the lessons that I've learned, I don't know if there are any that would emerge. I think that each person has taught me a great deal. Like I think about, and it's hindsight's always 2020, but I think about the 5th grade girl that I started working with at the academy. Mm-hmm. And I'm this big human. to her. And she is insecure to touch a basketball because she's not good at it yet. Having to learn how to communicate and meet her where she was, that is something that she taught me how to ask good questions. And so I think that every scenario, if you named people, I could tell you certain things, but I don't know if I could pick like a best one.
Okay. Well, a favorite one. And all I'm trying to like drag out because, like I said, you know your content better than I, and I'll say it again. You send out weekly, bi-weekly emails, and you put slivers of this content in there. And I've never opened one and said that was a waste of my time. Right. So you have a ton of this stuff, like interesting people, someone I'd love to talk with. So I'll just throw out a name and then maybe you can tell that story, is like a PJ Fleck, who at Western Michigan and now at Minnesota has been able to create cultures of great buy-in. Talk about a PJ Fleck. What is it about him?
So the first thing that comes to mind with PJ is what he calls How University. And anything that is expected is defined.
Mm.
And so he's not leaving anything up to chance. And so when I thought about that, I thought, what a great tool that is to leverage how to define the expectations of the program.
I love that. I mean, that's perfect right there. Super usable tool. This is a non-negotiable. It better be defined and reinforced, and not just touched on once on page 17 of the preseason packet, right? And you can't have too many of those either, can you?
You know, it's interesting. I think that I don't know the answer to that question, because the counterpoint to that would be, do you start putting pressure on stuff that doesn't matter?
Mm-hmm.
And is there a thing called compliance fatigue,
Mm-hmm.
where you're literally just going through the motion, trying to check the boxes?
Mm-hmm.
What I think is interesting to study is when you have like a basketball team, that's a small roster.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can build deep relationships
With
because
everyone as the head coach. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And then if you think about football, that's a 6 times multiple in some cases of basketball. So that the probability of you having to deal with behavioral issues is 6 times higher.
Mm-hmm.
And then how you navigate those situations communicates to the rest of the locker room, which you might not have as deeper relationships with,
Mm-hmm.
how you're going to run this program.
Mm-hmm.
And so just understanding those challenges, I think from PJ's perspective, because he has a bigger roster size, the how you makes a lot of sense, because he's trying to get out in front of everything you can possibly think of.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a basketball, you might have a little bit more of a leash because you can be a little more reactive to things because it's a smaller roster.
You see everything at every practice for the most part. Yeah, it is a different dynamic, for sure. Have you spent much time working with individual sport coaches, and maybe a comment on team culture in the individual sport world and how much it still matters?
Well, it's interesting because I think even the team sports that I work with have become more individualized, to
Mm.
where people are more likely to have brands within the brand. And I think when you think name, image, likeness, that's only going to accelerate that process.
True. Yeah.
So I think that it's all very interrelated, that we can learn from golf coaches. I think that, so each sport is different. The challenge with golf coaches, for example, is your whole team doesn't travel with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you navigate the people that are staying at home and making sure that they feel included and valued when the rest of the team is bonding through competition? And
And sitting in a hotel together.
correct.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think each sport presents its challenge. I think that's what I enjoy learning about so much, because it's almost like I work with an equestrian team.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even understand how the competition works.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like you're dropping an alien into a room. But what we found is that the human related issues are the impediments to performance.
Right.
And so,
Not the equestrian issues. Yeah.
and so we connect through that on how to build a stronger team.
Yeah. Yeah. And people are people, right? Whether you're chasing a ball or chasing a big sale, I mean, getting groups of people to work together based on the same principles, aren't they?
Whether you're making $20 million a year or you're a seventh grader who's trying to become a starter.
Hmm. Yeah. No, it's amazing. And everything we've talked about here, I live every day coaching my eighth grade sons and seventh and eighth graders soccer team, right? And the kids who are frustrated and the kids, right? And never, then you throw in with that age, who just grew 6 inches in the last 3 months and all of a sudden has totally lost control of their body and they're frustrated and everything hurts. And it's an amazing thing. But every time you take that moment as a coach to make the individual connection, to tell that kid, I see you,
Mhm.
it sticks with them. It helps them through that next phase for sure.
Bill Beswick had a great line. He said that there were four things that he would try and get people to feel. Do I feel cared for, needed, appreciated, and listened to?
Hmm.
And if teammates could look at the incomers that way, and that's how you move someone from below the line to the standard they live at,
Hmm.
uh, it's just such a different approach compared to we're going to bully you into the standard.
Isn't it? And it, I think that's such an important point. I don't want to let that just kind of slide by, because part of being intentional about your culture is having your upperclassmen or having your senior players bring in the new players to this. And it's a hard thing because those new players are potentially trying to take your spot. And yet you're saying pour into them, develop them, teach them what it means to be part of this group. And and yeah, they might take your spot too. And to create that team of selfless individuals is incredible. We had a guy named Caleb Porter on the podcast a couple weeks ago who coaches the Columbus Crew in Major League Soccer, and they won the MLS championship this past year during COVID. And in the final, two of their top players were suspended because of COVID for the final. And they had a 19-year-old had to step into the lineup and play. And the first interview he did, they said, what's it feel like to be, starting the MLS Cup final? And he said, I'm just so sad for Darlington Nagbe that he doesn't get to play this game. Right. And that's right. That's when you got it, isn't it?
It's a powerful concept.
Yeah.
And I think that the coach has such especially again from the college level down, has such an influence for that to take place. But I would say that if you look at coaches' behaviors, their behaviors are what's going to give them the access
Mm-hmm.
to influence the players to take on that mentality. Because the
Mm-hmm.
players understand, like you're negotiating for their best energy every day. And the players can feel, are you negotiating it for self gain
Mm-hmm.
or for team, for greater good?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They know if you're all in or not. Um, all right. Last piece here as we're coming to the end. You have this really cool new online coaching lab right now. And when I was watching the video, I think it just launched a couple weeks ago, and you were doing a collaboration and sort of a study and a course with University of Florida. So maybe talk about that for a little bit.
So the coaching lab is coaches from all different walks of life. And again, we're all there to try and hit these five pillars that we have:
Mm-hmm.
character development, behavior management, team dynamics, priority alignment, and self-awareness. And they all have their unique perspectives that they share with one another on how the best practices essentially on how to attack each of those pillars.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a live community. Becky Burleigh and I host it. We have a lot of people come in that we interview and then open it up to our community for them to ask questions. And I would say that it's a question-based community on how to navigate what drives winning.
And the level of coaches is everything from youth through collegiate and maybe beyond, right? So if a youth coach is listening to this now, it applies to them. Because I get people who are like, oh, I only coach 12-year-olds. That's not for me, but I think these things we talk about, they're for everyone, aren't they?
So I know that there would be a Power Five football coach that said, no, 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 no. You're exactly who I need to talk to. How are you breaking down the communication barrier to get your principles
Yeah.
in a simple way that the young mind can understand it?
Yeah, for sure. Um, in those 5 principles, those pillars that you said of what drives winning, I wanted to just talk about one before we go, because I think I'm a firm believer that, and again, I work mostly in the youth space, and I think the most important thing that we do as a youth coach is shape behavior, right? Because the right behaviors repeated over time, they accrue, right? And your performance, your weight, your athleticism, your grades, that's just this lagging measure of the things that you do, these right behaviors. So when it comes to behavior management, any tips from you? And I realize we're just scratching the surface here. When you have a player, an athlete who just won't get on board, is there a process to go through?
Yeah, you just have to figure out like where the line is. So Chris Peterson addressed this question, that he had a line that he said, win them over or weed them out.
Mm-hmm.
And they do everything that they can to win them over. And that's a macro or a micro strategy that
Mm-hmm.
you can weed them out of a drill, a practice, a game, multiple games, season, maybe team. And there's probably a progression that you take. I think the hardest question to ask coaches is, maybe there's 2 of them. When did you realize you can't save everyone?
Mm-hmm.
And when do you know when it's time to cut someone loose?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I heard another coach one time say, maybe one third one to add to that, which was know yourself in terms of how many of those maybe I can win them overs I can afford to have on a roster,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because some coaches can manage 5 of them and some can manage 1. And knowing yourself of like how much energy am I willing to put into those to win them over is I think a part. But that's great. Anything else, Brett? And how can people connect with you, learn about your work, follow you on social media, all that sort of stuff?
So just going back to that one
Oh
piece,
yes, sorry.
because I feel like I want to say something, man,
Oh,
on
you
that.
man, you're the guest, man. You're the guest.
No, I just feel like the ones, especially at the youth space,
Yeah,
the ones that are the hardest to win over are the ones that need you the most.
yeah.
And to me, that's the separator for coaches, because when you do get that kid, they can be the biggest influence of the group because they
Mhm.
see the strides. And the other ones, like, they don't really need you. Like, they kind of do, and you're going to make them better and all the stuff, but they're going to go on and be fine. But it's the fringe kids that need you most. And man, like, how powerful are those stories when you can get someone interested that just you're hitting the wall. And one of the things Chris says too is that there are no bad students,
Mhm.
only poor teaching.
Mhm.
And now, of course, we know there are people that are harder to risk, but he looks at that as more of a mentality as
Mhm.
opposed to a theory, because you just, those are the stories, man, that you're going to remember on your deathbed, that you didn't give up on the kid.
100%. I talk to any coach, and that's who they remember, and that's the
They make
kid.
you better too, man. Like, because
Yeah,
they're clearly, you're not affecting them. So it's like you have to modify your approach. And sometimes it's like continuing to modify the approach to finally figure out something that hits.
yeah, and it all goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, that one-on-one connection of, um, you know, to go back, Jack Clark. Why guess what you can know? So dig into that kid, find out why he's always late, find out why he's not focused. Well, maybe it's because his house is a mess and he doesn't sleep at night and whatever. Like, and that's this whole new lens for you that really, I think, that's coaching. That takes you from being a trainer to being a coach.
And that's what our lab is. It's
Hmm.
people that that are constantly finding new ways to reach a new audience.
Mm. I'm glad you said that because that was a great thing to end on right there. How about that?
You just triggered something in me, man. And I was like, because I do think that mentality Chris has, it creates such a high level of accountability
Hmm.
with the teacher.
Hmm. Yeah, when you look at yourself first, and instead of,
I mean,
uh,
seriously, you go to practices,
yeah,
and how many times have you seen a coach where there's dysfunction and you're observing and you walk over to them and they'll put their hand over their mouth and you say, "You see the stuff I have to put up with every day?"
hmm, oh yeah,
It'll never get better if that's the mentality.
right. Or they say, God, these seniors, but our freshmen are fantastic. When they're seniors, it's going to be great. And then 4 years later, oh man, these seniors, yeah, it's it. It's that. It starts with me, or what's the Navy SEAL Jocko, right? Extreme ownership. Like you own everything. If you own everything, uh, your players will start to own it too. And that's a pretty powerful thing.
And speaks to modeling.
It speaks exactly to modeling. All right, now's your chance. How can people find you?
So if you go to whatdriveswinning.com, there's a lot of resources there. One thing that I might recommend to your listeners is the new book is What Drives Winning Environments.
Hmm.
And then we have a workshop that I actually did with Chris Peterson. And we have over 100 videos, 100 questions that you can plug into your staff and your team. And you can find that at learn.whatdriveswinning.com. And the coaching lab information is also on there. And that is a community of like-minded people that are just trying to ask questions on how they can be better as a leader.
Brilliant. Brett, thanks so much for being on the Way of Champions, man. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you very much, John, for having me.